without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first guest. She is an Iranian American artist, activist, and Brandeis professor of the arts. She's very passionate about a lot of things and uses her art to really push forward change and have a lot of conversations that are really important and necessary. And somehow she has this really great tendency to find an appreciation for the best and worst part of humanity, which is why she's on the show, which is why she's great. So please join me in welcoming Sheida Soleimani.
Hi.
Okay, have a seat right here. Yeah, nice. A little birdie, notice the bird, okay, keep track. A little birdie told me that you have a really cool talent, something that you spend a lot of time on, you're passionate about. Do you want to tell everyone what that little birdie told me?
I raise and rehabilitate wild birds that have been injured. Generally, whether it be by humans or they've like run into like a window or they fall out of a nest. I don't have anyone that's being winterized except my 3 chickens that came to me because this woman brought them to me saying that she found a wild hawk. It wasn't a hawk, it was a chicken.
It was an actual chicken?
Yeah, legit chicken.
Yeah.
But people don't really like know what birds they have. Like a lot of the time, you know, they'll like find a pigeon and they'll call me and they'll be like, I found a vulture. And I'm like, no, it's
a pigeon.
It's a pigeon.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have the chickens. But over the summer, I had over 152 birds. That was, I have to keep track of how many I have for the state. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
It's fun.
So how did this get started? Like, was it something that you did when you were younger or inspired by your childhood, or is it just, you know, something that came about as you started to do more art?
It all kind of started because of my mom. Who was a nurse when she was in Iran. My parents are both political refugees. So my mom escaped later than my father, but when she came to the States, she'd undergone a lot of trauma and she couldn't practice as a nurse anymore and didn't really speak English. And we ended up in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, of all places, which was like hella white. And we were like the only Middle Eastern family there, didn't like, you know, really know who to talk to or what to do. And so my mom started finding all these like, you know, basically like half-dead roadkill animals on the side of the road, and not knowing like how to help them, she would bring them into the house and start trying to like save them in some way, shape, or form based off of her like training as a nurse. So I just grew up with that. There would always be like raccoons with like splints made out of like popsicle sticks on their back legs, or like, you know, bunnies that had gotten hit by a car that she was trying to like resuscitate, tons of birds. Like she would let me stay home from school some days if she had like a baby bird that needed to be fed, because we would just sit up there with like a pair of tweezers and like put food in its own mouth.
Oh.
Yeah. And then I got to college and I started doing it too. So my first college apartment in Cincinnati, my bathroom was where I kept all of my birds.
It was filled with birds?
Anyone that would find a bird, I was like the bird girl. And they would bring me a bird. And I would, you know, keep them in my bathroom with like the door shut, and I'd have all these different species in there and then let them go. And then it happened in grad school, and now it's like for real.
It's just your thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's just my thing. I have a whole clinic in my basement. I love it.
That sounds great. But you mentioned that you grew up in Ohio. Could you tell us a bit more about that? I've been to Ohio once. I think I went to Columbus. It was okay. It wasn't anything special.
My condolences.
But tell us a bit more about Ohio.
I grew up in this suburb, in a sense, like a farm suburb of Cincinnati called Loveland, Ohio. And we were the only non-white family where I grew up. So it was intense, especially after 9/11. Like there were a lot of like, you know, kids that don't know much about the Middle East. And so I got lots of like Bibles shoved in my locker, and our house got TP'd a lot, and people would like pee on our doorstep. Like, but it's because I think also the American understanding and how the Midwest like portrays the Mideast in a lot of ways. So it was a strange place.
Strange. So you mentioned like a lot of the effects being the only, you know, family of like non-white family in your neighborhood. How did that translate to school life?
It was rough. I remember I tried to like make friends, like so many different ways of trying to make friends. I remember one time I even bought this girl a pair of Nike Shox because they were like the shoe
thing at the time, yeah.
At the time, and I saved up all my allowance money to like buy this girl a pair of Nike Shox because I wanted her to be my friend, and she accepted the pair of shoes because like who wouldn't? They were cool, but also was like not my friend. I didn't have a ton of like close friends. Everyone else was like having summer parties and hanging out, and I was like in the creek, like hanging out, like identifying like, newts and salamanders and testing pond water.
How would you say like the perception of other students at your school of like you and your upbringing and like even your family? Would you say that had like any effect on like you socially or like anything like that?
100%, especially in Ohio because like it is mostly like Catholic where I was growing up, and I was raised without religion. My parents have always taught me to be like very respectful of any religion, but they just raised me without it. And my dad got really into Halloween too. And so he would get so into Halloween because everyone loved Christmas so much that he would leave our Halloween decorations up until Christmas. So everyone at school was convinced that I was like a demon child or something. Their perception of me was like pretty, like, oh, that's a strange girl. I didn't speak English until I was about 10, so she doesn't really speak English. Oh, her parents, like, worship the devil. I was not the most social as a child. And then I got to college, and when you're in art school, it's, like, cool to be weird. So then people started being friends with me because they're like, whoa, this person's really strange, which is my version of normal.
Got it. No, you're the coolest person. Like, we love you here.
Thank you. I love being here.
So you mentioned that your parents were both political refugees from Iran. Your dad got out before your mom did. But one thing that I found interesting, just like reading about your story, is that from a young age, you were told a lot about the things that they endured in Iran. What impact would you say that had on you?
I learned the truth really young. Like there's a lot of parents that are like, oh, we can't tell our kids that Santa's not real or whatever. There's never any Santa for me. Or like the tooth fairy, or like there's this suspension of disbelief because people think that they need to treat children like they're delicate and fragile. Right. And I think one thing that I learned off the bat was like, I was 4 years old, 4 years old from what I started to remember, going to bed and my mom's telling me about working in a leper asylum. And I think my first fear was leprosy hiding under my bed, not like the boogeyman.
Right.
And thinking about, she would share her experience being like tortured and like raped. And my dad would talk about, what it meant to be like politically resistant against a totalitarian regime. So I think truth was like a big thing that stuck with me, and I'm really glad, it was a little traumatizing. I was definitely like a child therapist, but it was cool. I'm glad they did it.
Mm-hmm. So looking at that like today, would you say that it has impacted your work or even the kind of activism that you do now?
100%. You're not going to learn what's happening in the world just by looking at your phone. You learn it by experience or by having conversations or by asking questions, which I think a lot of people don't do enough of. Mm-hmm. They'll see like, oh, this happened across the world. Now I know that it happened, and they won't take the time to learn about the background.
You just keep scrolling.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, To Oblivion. Super popular piece that you did. Talk to us a bit about that for the people who don't know what it is and the work that stood for, especially with the women who were executed in Iran.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. I think for me, like having the background of my parents, like, my dad escaped, my mom was tortured and raped by the government, and I was making work before To Oblivion about human rights violation victims across the board, like all types of people. And I got to my next series of work and I was like, who am I gonna make this work about and who is it for? And I thought about my mom and how, she could have been one of these women that was executed, but wasn't, but she still, underwent a lot of trauma. And I started thinking about state-sanctioned violence towards women, specifically in Iran. Mm-hmm. Especially in the US, we know that there are like egregious human rights violations in the Middle East or parts of the Middle East, but we don't really call those countries out on that because of our relationships to them via trade.
Right.
So I kind of wanted to start bringing that to the forefront a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So in To Oblivion, I worked with a lot of human rights lawyers in Iran, communicating with them via the dark web to find records of women that have been executed by the Iranian regime. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these women's records are completely buried. It's super messed up, but they just don't want to accept that they're doing this or show that they're doing it. So I got in touch with their families, started getting information about them, getting in touch with lawyers to get information about them, and used these images that were like the traces that were left over of these women to create these sculptural, figurative forms of these women that were then photographed.
So were these images provided to you from the family, or did you have to go through some crazy way of getting them?
There was a lot of crazy ways, because I also like to get in touch with those families. You can't do that. Internet is something that's watched in Iran, right. So you have to do it through a dark web server. And I think the most important thing for me was that I would never use an image of a body that has been deceased, or has died without consent from the family.
So on the flip side, what was the public reaction like to to oblivion in like these images and sculptures?
So it's kind of been split, you know, like in the art world, we want a reprieve, right? Like we want to look at something that's like beautiful or like a flower and it's like, oh, it's like what a sublime, beautiful flower. But if you have an image of a woman that's like executed, even if it is not outright a violent or aggressive image, you know, the content, you might not want to spend time with it. You might not want to like, you know, hang that in your living room or whatever, because art is also, in a sense, a form of capitalism. The other half of the art world really took to it and was like, okay, and not just the art world, outside of that, like academia, like just like popular media, people are like, oh, well, we didn't know that that was a thing. And of course, I'm like, yeah, of course you didn't, because like, you know, where do you get your news? But it's been a really important means for me to try to like bring that to the surface. A lot of the Iranian community, you know, it's kind of split too, because a lot of them are part of the government. So the ones that are not or have been affected by this are really like thankful for the work. But the people that are, you know, in line with the Iranian government were not happy about it, accused me of being a spy or, you know, spreading false information about the government. I've gotten lots of death threats, voicemails, at Brandeis even. I've gotten like voicemails from people, you know.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's been intense. And it's, you know, Iranian government has a long history of sending people out from the Besiege, which is a paramilitary group, to leave the country and execute people outside of Iranian territory. So happens all the time.
So have you been back to Iran as of late? No?
I wish. I'm exiled. So it's like a big, you know, that's kind of a thing, a choice that I decided to make for my work is, do I need to go back to the country that I'm from? Or would I rather bring this information to light and lose my right to go back? And a lot of the people that are living in Iran don't have the ability to talk about this because they will be executed. So if I'm in a space where I'm not going to openly be harmed, I'm ready to talk about that stuff and give up my right to go back.
You don't think that that space will exist anytime soon?
I think the government rules with brute force and fear. And as long as they're able to do that, there hasn't been space for an opposition to kind of come to the forefront. And every time there has been opposition, it's been smothered out. So if it's going to change, I think there has to be room for an opposition to build. And I think there needs to be work from, you know, countries in the United Nations and outside of Iran to actually, like, we know at this point that the government's totalitarian and cruel, but we don't really want to contend with it.
Right. As a person in academia, as a professor, like at a school like Brandeis or just any academic space, how does this affect that part of like your work?
I think one thing that really bothers me about academia is that people have to like feel like they're reserved to like be a teacher. And I think for me, it's that like, this is an exchange. Like I learn as much from my students as they can learn from me. And if we all have different experiences, I think it's important to talk about them. Academia has always been a space for mobilizing intelligentsia and mobilizing youth. And we're in a space where we're fortunate enough to have the privilege to be at an institution. And if we have that space, why not utilize it in a way that's not just learning about, you know, math and science? And if we are learning about art, like why do we have to always learn about important people that are in the field or in the practice? Why can't we be the important people or start those discussions?
What would you say is like the key to being a change maker, especially for people who do art or just anything?
Patience,
Change
for
is
sure.
slow?
Change is so slow. I mean, like we expect things, especially in a media-saturated economy, like you were saying, for things to happen quickly. And if we don't pay attention to the history that's come before our contemporary moment, we're not going to be able to make a change. So I think patience and perseverance, you know, like that's a big thing. Like just because it's not working now, you can't give up. Like, do I think that my artwork about executed women is going to stop women from being executed? No way. But do I think it's going to at least give people information to like start learning about something, and maybe down the road, if enough people start learning about it, they could keep it with them as like a grain of thought, and then change could happen.
All right, and I think we'll leave it there. But I have one favor, one thing.
What
I'm
you
gonna put you
got?
on the spot. Can we get a bird call? let's get the bird
Yeah,
call.
let's see. Oh, damn.
Sheida, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank
Thank you so much.
No, I really appreciate it.
That was great.